Are Western military bases in Africa truly irreplaceable? Burkina Faso's Traoré is prepared to challenge that notion. But with past leaders like Thomas Sankara paying a heavy price, is he prepared to face the fallout? And if so, which nation might back Burkina Faso with troops? Let's find out. Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré recently made a groundbreaking move that has resonated globally. By welcoming Cuban and Venezuelan troops, he has aligned Burkina Faso with two nations long famed for their defiance against Western dominance. This decision is significant for Burkina Faso's defense and independence. For decades, the West has exerted control over Africa through economic dependency and military alliance. Traoré's actions send a clear message. Burkina Faso, like Cuba and Venezuela, is ready to assert its autonomy, even if it means breaking from powerful nations that still see Africa as a subordinate partner. So why should this decision be of concern to the West? Because this alliance challenges the very foundations of Western influence in Africa. If Burkina Faso can develop its defenses and economy through partnerships that promote genuine equality, it questions the need for Western assistance altogether. And if one African nation can succeed with non-Western allies, what's to stop others from following suit? Western influence in Africa has often been based on a transactional model: military support in exchange for access to resources or political sway. But Traoré's choice to partner with countries that have successfully resisted Western hegemony for decades suggests a potential shift towards alliances that are grounded in mutual respect. Cuba and Venezuela don't bring the same baggage as Western powers, which often come with economic strings attached. Instead, they bring a history of solidarity with developing nations and a demonstrated commitment to resilience. Is the West truly prepared for an Africa that charts its course? Many in Western capitals likely see Traoré's alliance as a threat to their interests on the continent. The message is clear: Burkina Faso will not be a pawn in someone else's game. It's a new era where African countries could redefine partnerships on their terms, free from the economic and political constraints often imposed by the West. This shift could inspire a wave of African self-reliance that redefines the continent's global position and disrupts the West's traditional dominance. But why are Cuba and Venezuela preferred? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. For some, Burkina Faso's choice of allies, Cuba and Venezuela, may seem unconventional. After all, one might expect alliances to be based on economic power or geographic proximity. But there's a deeper, symbolic meaning here. Cuba and Venezuela are two nations that have consistently defied Western dominance, especially that of the United States, and face sanctions and blockades with remarkable resilience. Their histories resonate with the African experience of colonialism and exploitation, and they represent what it means to remain sovereign despite external pressure. Both Cuba and Venezuela are fiercely anti-imperialist. They have built their national identities on resisting Western interference and developing self-sustained systems. For Burkina Faso, aligning with these countries isn't just about military support. It's about joining forces with like-minded nations who understand the challenges and rewards of independence. It's a message that Burkina Faso values sovereignty over appeasing traditional powers. Through this alliance, Traoré is making it clear that he sees no reason for his country to depend on Western validation to chart its course. And both countries have demonstrated that it's possible to survive, if not thrive, without the approval or support of the West. For instance, despite facing some of the harshest economic sanctions in modern history, Cuba has developed an internationally recognized healthcare system, excelling in areas like preventative medicine and doctor training. Venezuela, rich in resources and expertise in energy, has faced numerous Western sanctions, yet continues to pursue economic self-reliance. Burkina Faso stands to gain practical benefits from this alliance too. Cuban and Venezuelan expertise in guerrilla warfare, resilience under sanctions, and the development of local defense systems is invaluable to a country that aims to reduce its dependency on external powers. For instance, Cuba's medical assistance and Venezuela's energy strategies can help Burkina Faso develop sectors vital for independence without needing Western aid, which often comes with restrictive conditions. This is about building an economy and defense system that stands independently, a break from the cycles of dependency that have plagued many African nations. Apart from this, these two nations offer Burkina Faso a lot. Burkina Faso's alliance with Cuba and Venezuela goes beyond military aid. It's a blueprint for economic independence that directly challenges the debt-driven dependency model promoted by Western nations. Historically, many African nations have relied on financial aid and loans from Western countries and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. These loans often come with conditions that influence national policies, making it difficult for countries to act in their best interests. Western financial institutions often offer assistance that, instead of building long-term self-sufficiency, traps countries in cycles of dependency. In 2023, for example, the African Development Bank noted that 40% of sub-Saharan African countries were in or at risk of debt distress due to reliance on Western financial aid. Burkina Faso, by partnering with Cuba and Venezuela, is sidestepping this model entirely, focusing on equitable economic exchange, skills transfer, and self-reliance. Cuba and Venezuela, unlike traditional Western allies, aren't looking to control Burkina Faso's resources or dictate its policies. Their support emphasizes development in healthcare, education, and local resource management without strings attached. For instance, Cuba has already committed to sending medical professionals to assist Burkina Faso in building a resilient healthcare system, a move that reduces the country's reliance on Western medical aid. Meanwhile, Venezuela's expertise in energy security offers Burkina Faso a path to sustainable development in this crucial sector. In a country like Burkina Faso, where energy shortages are common, Venezuelan support in establishing sustainable energy systems can significantly reduce costs and free resources for other developmental needs. On the military front, Cuban and Venezuelan troops bring strategies that have been honed by years of defending against foreign interference. These strategies focus on guerrilla warfare, community defense, and infrastructure resilience, which align well with Burkina Faso's desire for self-sustaining security. This alliance hasn't gone unnoticed by the West, especially by former colonial powers with a long-standing interest in African affairs. For these nations, accustomed to their role as benefactors or overseers, the alignment of Burkina Faso with two anti-imperialist nations poses an existential threat to their influence. Western countries, particularly the United States and France, have maintained a strong military presence in West Africa, justifying it under the guise of counterterrorism or stability. But with Burkina Faso forging new alliances outside of this influence, it forces a re-evaluation of who truly benefits from this military presence. Is it surprising that the West would be concerned? After all, if African nations can secure their independence and stability without Western involvement, it challenges the very premise of Western aid. The presence of Cuban and Venezuelan troops symbolizes a shift in the power dynamic, a move away from dependence on Western military and economic support toward alliances grounded in mutual respect. For the West, this is unsettling because it reveals that Africa can indeed assert its autonomy without relying on former colonial powers. This alliance could also serve as a beacon for other African nations. Countries watching Burkina Faso's bold stance might realize they too can choose alliances that support true sovereignty rather than impose dependency. This shift, if it gains momentum, could mark a significant rebalancing of power on the continent, challenging the legitimacy of Western interventionist policies and encouraging more African nations to reassess their alliances. But the West isn't known to give up its influence easily. Western powers might attempt to sway public opinion or governments in Africa by portraying such alliances as a threat to regional stability or progress. In reality, this realignment poses a threat only to the West's control, not to Africa's stability. How ironic that a continent's pursuit of sovereignty is viewed as destabilizing by those who claim to support its freedom. This framing is not only misleading but suggests a paternalistic approach to African autonomy. So, in the long term, what's the significance of the new alliances? For many Africans, Traoré's alliances with Cuba and Venezuela represent a possible future where African nations prioritize self-determination over dependency. This alliance isn't just an isolated event. It reflects a broader trend in African geopolitics, a rejection of Western dominance in favor of partnerships that are based on equality, shared values, and mutual respect. South-South cooperation, like Burkina Faso's new alliances, isn't just a political experiment. It's a practical strategy that can help African nations address their needs for economic diversification, technological advancement, and sustainable development. A study by the African Union highlighted that countries engaged in South-South cooperation often experience more sustainable growth than those dependent on Western aid. This approach allows nations to pool resources and expertise without the economic and political strings often attached to Western support. This isn't to say that Traoré's path is without risk. Choosing to align with Cuba and Venezuela invites scrutiny and possible retaliation from Western powers. However, Traoré's stance embodies a spirit of resilience and sovereignty that resonates with many Africans. By reducing dependency on Western powers, Burkina Faso is setting a precedent that could reshape African diplomacy and encourage other nations to explore paths to autonomy. So, could Burkina Faso's stance inspire a broader movement across the continent? This question is at the heart of the alliance's significance. If more African nations choose alliances that respect sovereignty over dependency, it could lead to a new era of African diplomacy where countries work together to solve regional challenges without relying on former colonial powers. While we have talked about how the West would mine this new alliance, what actions will it take? In response to Burkina Faso's pivot away from Western influence, Western powers have already started considering economic sanctions, a familiar tool used to maintain control. But don't sanctions reveal more about the West's insecurity than Burkina Faso's defiance? After all, if Burkina Faso's alliance with Cuba and Venezuela is truly inconsequential, why would it provoke such a response? Sanctions are a tactic that Cuba and Venezuela know well, and they've adapted their economies to withstand external pressure. For Burkina Faso, these alliances provide not just moral support, but practical guidance on how to navigate and mitigate the impact of potential sanctions. With assistance from Cuba in healthcare and Venezuela in energy, Burkina Faso is building resilience in critical areas, reducing its vulnerability to external economic pressures. By drawing on the experiences of its allies, Burkina Faso is reinforcing its economy, making it less reliant on Western aid or approval. Isn't it telling that Western powers react to African autonomy with punitive measures rather than support? This reaction illustrates a discomfort with the idea of a truly independent Africa. However, sanctions may not have the intended effect. Burkina Faso's citizens could see these measures as an attack on their country's right to self-determination, rallying even more support for Traoré's administration. Western sanctions may attempt to stifle Burkina Faso's independence, but the alliances with Cuba and Venezuela offer a roadmap for resilience, a model that, if successful, could encourage other African nations to consider alternatives to Western support. Now, an important question is, what will happen if Africa completely ends its ties with the West? If Africa were to sever ties with the West completely, we'd likely witness a transformation unlike anything the continent has seen in recent history. For far too long, Africa's potential has been shackled by Western dependencies, exploitative trade practices, and a relentless drain of resources that should have fueled the continent's prosperity rather than someone else's. Imagine for a moment an Africa unbound by Western interests, a continent fully in control of its resources, policies, and economic future. What would that look like? Well, it's a vision of self-determination, regional unity, and unprecedented empowerment. First, let's address the common Western narrative that Africa needs Western aid or partnerships to develop. This assertion is simply a relic of a colonial mindset that assumes Africa cannot function independently, an idea rooted in outdated paternalism. The West's assistance has often come with hefty strings attached, including economic policies that prioritize foreign investors over local industries, creating a vicious cycle of dependency. Severing these ties would allow Africa to shift its focus to what truly matters, building robust intracontinental trade networks and investing in homegrown industries that directly benefit African citizens rather than padding Western profits. After all, why should Africa's coffee, diamonds, and oil be exported for pennies only to be sold back at inflated prices. An independent Africa could set fair prices and ensure that wealth generated from its resources stays within its borders, benefiting its people.
Questo è un bambino che lavora in una miniera d'oro in Burkina Faso. Il Burkina Faso è una delle nazioni più povere del mondo. Per il Burkina Faso, che ha l'oro, la Francia stampa moneta coloniale. In cambio pretende che finiscano nelle casse del tesoro francese il 50% di tutto quello che il Burkina Faso esporta. L'oro che questo bambino si infila in un cunicolo per tirare fuori finisce per lo più nelle casse dello Stato francese. Allora la soluzione non è prendere gli africani e spostarli in Europa, la soluzione è liberare l'Africa da certi europei che la sfruttano e consentire a queste persone di vivere di quello che hanno.
There's another point often raised by critics, that Western military presence is necessary to maintain security in Africa. This is a thinly veiled excuse for control, using the guise of stability to justify military bases that primarily serve Western interests. When we look closely, it's clear that the presence of these bases has often exacerbated local conflicts rather than resolved them. By breaking free from these so-called security arrangements, African nations could form alliances that respect their sovereignty, perhaps even with non-Western powers willing to cooperate without demanding control. Western security arrangements have rarely empowered Africa. Instead, they've positioned Africa as a pawn in global power games. An independent Africa would not only safeguard its land and resources, but could also develop a unified defense strategy with fellow African nations, strengthening regional unity and fostering a collective African identity rather than depending on external forces. Now, some may argue that Western nations offer valuable cultural and technological exchange, but let's not be deceived by this shallow argument. It assumes that Africa cannot cultivate its cultural renaissance or drive technological innovation from within, when, in reality, African societies have long had a rich cultural heritage and a rising tech sector with the potential to rival global hubs. Breaking ties with the West would allow Africa to celebrate and invest in its own cultural identity without Western dominance. This independence would empower young Africans to embrace their heritage fully, boosting morale and unity across borders. Moreover, cutting ties with the West doesn't mean isolation. Rather, it opens doors for Africa to build relationships with partners who value mutual respect and collaboration. Imagine the potential alliances with nations in Asia, South America, and even within Africa itself that could emerge, unrestrained by the often exploitative frameworks imposed by the West. These alliances could transform Africa into a powerful bloc on the world stage, positioning it as an equal, not as a dependent. Western influence has long prevented Africa from setting its environmental standards, prioritizing African ecosystems over corporate profits. Western corporations have often disregarded environmental impacts for the sake of resource extraction, causing pollution and loss of biodiversity that have hit Africa hardest. By taking control, Africa could establish an environmental agenda that prioritizes sustainable practices, protecting its ecosystems and pioneering green initiatives tailored to the continent's unique needs. Critics might still insist that severing ties would bring insurmountable challenges. But this argument ignores Africa's resilience and the powerful drive towards self-sufficiency that is already building momentum across the continent. By taking the reins of its future, Africa wouldn't merely survive without the West. It would thrive in a way that's authentic, sustainable, and wholly its own. Ending ties with the West isn't about shutting doors. It's about opening new ones that lead to a future shaped by Africa's vision for Africa. So, to sum this up, Burkina Faso's partnerships with Cuba and Venezuela represent more than just strategic alliances. They symbolize a new vision for African sovereignty. This alignment marks a significant challenge to the Western dominance that has historically shaped Africa's geopolitical landscape. As African nations seek to assert their independence, Burkina Faso's actions could set a powerful example for others to follow. Is this the beginning of a new era for African autonomy? Will more nations join? What happens once the ties are ended with the West? Let us know in the comments section. Does Africa need the West, or does the West need Africa? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.